Aphex Twin, Orbital, David Guetta, and C418 are all getting videos, don't worry. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today... Jean-Michel Jarre's Odds and Ends. It's about time for that lovely segment on these discography reviews where I go down all the other side projects and things from an artist that I still have something to say about, but not enough to fill an entire video. This isn't covering everything that Jarre's ever released that I didn't already discuss. There are still a couple of stray tracks here and there left behind, and obviously there are live albums and greatest hits compilations that I have nothing to say about, but this is everything I have. This is everything left that I have proper discussion material on. I will say that some of the material I had here was initially going to be the first video in this series, talking about the stuff he did before Oxygen, but I decided against starting the series that way since Oxygen was so much better an introduction to the guy and the earlier stuff wasn't as important to the story in my opinion. So it all got relegated to this video, and why don't we start with that stuff? Let's just get right into it. So why don't we begin all the way back in 1969, where Jarre was producing an experimental single by the name of La Cage/Erosmachine, which would later be released in 1971 since it took him that long to find a label who would be willing to actually release something as crazy sounding as this. And yeah, it's a pretty freaky pair of tracks. There are definitely sounds in there that resemble those that Jarre would go on to use in his mainline career. For the most part, though, it reminds me of Kraftwerk's first album. Very out there Pink Floyd, Ummagumma-esque stuff that I'm not sure would have gotten as much attention these days if it had come from someone with a less recognizable name. Between the two, I definitely prefer Erosmachine, since there is actually a bit of a melodic organ pad in there, but it later devolves into literal screaming by the end. And La Cage has some synths that are almost tonal, but not quite. Not that fun to listen to, honestly. But I will say the single is cool as a curiosity for people wanting to hear the complete story of what got Jarre to where he is now, though. Anyways, after that, we will move on to 1972, and we get to his first full album, called Deserted Palace. Now, we aren't quite at the point where Jarre is ready to change the world and deliver electronic music to the masses. Even Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream weren't at that point yet. Nah, this album was really only meant as a compilation of production music for TV and films and the like, and was a pretty low-key release that I don't think drew much of anyone in at the time. It's become an extremely rare recording, having been well overshadowed by Oxygen, and admittedly for good reason. That being said, being a completionist as always, I sought this album out of curiosity, and I actually think it's a really enjoyable release. People often label this as experimental, but to be perfectly honest, with the exception of a few tracks, the melodies on this album are actually pretty catchy and fun to listen to. The main problem with this album is that it sounds extremely dated and cheap. It's experimental in the sense that Jarre doesn't really know what he's doing with this whole electronic music thing yet. I feel like Jarre was being held back by a lack of budget and having to work with some primitive sounding equipment that sounds pretty harsh and almost a little unpleasant, but I do think the actual compositions make up for it. Like, you got pretty esoteric song titles here with names like Music Box Concerto, Rainforest Rap Session, A Love Theme for Gargoyles, Bee Factory, etc. And Jarre tries to make all these pieces live up to their names. Rainforest Rap Session doesn't sound like a rap song or anything, maybe what might qualify as such in 1972, but it is a funky sort of track that sounds like it had some rainforest sound effects in the middle. Bee Factory has a vaguely industrial theme but with lots and lots of buzzing sound effects. And Love Theme for Gargoyles has weird effects around the melody that sound like those are trying to be the gargoyles or something. Of course then, that track suddenly switches over to a super pitched down sample of Lynyrd Skynyrd's Sweet Home Alabama out of nowhere, and I have no idea what that means. Admittedly, there are some tracks that don't really have a melody, like Free Floating Anxiety, which just sounds extremely dissonant and spooky, or Exasperated Frog, which is just a sound effect that sounds like what the title says, I guess. But there are also some pretty fun and danceable tracks like Synthetic Jungle and Pogo Rock, or something like Bridge of Promises, which starts out with an organ riff that sounds very similar to the one DJ Shadow sampled for his tracks Organ Donor and Stem/Long Stem. And the track that builds into something really fun after that. The longest track on this album is Windswept Canyon, clocking in at 7 minutes, while the others are around 1 to 3 minutes. This song honestly sounds like a demo that grew into like the first part of Oxygen or something. Probably one of my favorite tracks. Overall, on Deserted Palace, I will admit it's not a good starting point if you've never heard anything Jarre's had to offer. Again, start with Oxygen instead. This stuff is incredibly low budget, hokey, and silly. It's very much an experimental release in the same way Kraftwerk's first two albums were. It's kind of the I don't really know what I'm doing yet release. But to me, this album honestly achieves more than just a mere curiosity for the superfans. Unlike Kraftwerk's first two, there's a lot of prominent melodies that are fun to listen to and plenty of actual entertainment to be had here. I would much rather return to this than either of Kraftwerk's first two. I mean, sure, there's nothing here as good as Kling Klang, but it's a lot more consistently fun. In fact, there's honestly more variety here than can be found on most of Jarre's more successful albums, though, again, the limited synth tones and hokiness hold it back from being something truly great. But there is enough substance and enjoyability to be found here that I'd actually say it's worth looking into. Deserted Palace is a good debut, even if heavily prototypical. I think it's a solid 7 out of 10 for me. Now I have to talk about his second album as well, which is his soundtrack to the film Les Granges Brulees, or The Burnt Barns in English. It would make sense for Jarre to do a soundtrack at this early point, actually, because his father is Maurice Jarre, composer for films such as Lawrence of Arabia, and Deserted Palace was kind of a low-budget collection of production music for ads and the like, so why not try scoring a full film himself? I thought back when I checked these out a couple of years ago, I thought, okay, I like Deserted Palace quite a bit, so I was optimistic going into this, but unfortunately I didn't enjoy it nearly as much. It has a lot of the same problems Deserted Palace had, most notably the fact that the synthesizer tones are quite harsh and dated and low budget. But unfortunately, as this is the score to just one film, there isn't nearly as much variety to be found on it. Reusing melodies in a film score is to be expected, but it's especially disappointing here because of the limited synth tones Jarre is still using. It all leads to most of these songs sounding like exact duplicates of each other. The most glaring example is that of the first and last track on the album, Les Chansons de Granges Brulees and Générique. I'm gonna get all the French pronunciations wrong. These quite literally only differ by 30 seconds in their running time and are otherwise exactly the same song, right down to the female singing. And the title track here just has a synth setting playing the melody instead of singing. Again, I realize that it is a film soundtrack and it wasn't supposed to achieve any higher purpose than fit the mood of the film, which apparently is some kind of murder mystery set in the Jura Mountains. And the melodies themselves are alright. Certainly does have a particularly haunting and uncomfortable vibe. I haven't seen the film myself, probably works better in context, and it could end up using the low-budget style to its advantage. But as an album experience, it is kind of a disappointing and repetitive listen. The soundtrack album may clock in at less than half an hour, but it felt a lot longer than that to me. And if this were actually a more subtle experience than Deserted Palace, that'd be one thing. I suppose technically this is, but it's still incredibly heavy-handed and campy. It's not vague spookiness to accompany this vibe of this small town where it takes place. It sounds like it was made by people living in said village. The cheapness is kind of distracting here, and I think this might take away from what Jarre's going for. Unless the film is also super heavy-handed and campy and doesn't know how ridiculous it is as well, but I've never actually seen it, so I wouldn't know. Now, it's not like every track on here sounds exactly the same, they just basically all have the same melody. And a lot of them have the exact same instrumentation. Maybe one sounded like an organ, but another sounded like a harpsichord, but maybe one moved faster and another moved slower. It's hard to remember which track is which sometimes. Though there are some moments where it sounds like he's brought in a sound that he would later bring into a later recording once his career actually got started, like on the third track. Something sounds familiar about the sound of that one. There are some tracks which try to add more atonal and strange effects for the sake of suspense. And there are some tracks that don't just rehash the melody from the first track, but that's pretty much just zigzag and reconstitution. The latter isn't precisely a huge standout as it is just kind of a bunch of quick, dissonant chord stabs for some kind of suspenseful moment in the movie. But I'm glad it breaks the mold. Zigzag, on the other hand, is a much bigger standout. It sounds completely different from the rest of the soundtrack. While most of it is very somber and spooky, Zigzag is like some kind of peppy circus theme. It's so ridiculous it's almost completely out of place, but I do think it is one of the best moments on here just because of that. But yeah, overall, while I don't feel like this album was a waste of time, I will say I don't see myself returning to it again. It's too repetitive, there's little to no variety, it's too much of an unpleasant dirge to be fun, but too cheap sounding to fully take seriously. And while I understand why it sounds the way it does, I just personally don't enjoy it much. It comes off as a major slug to me. Overall, I'd say it's best enjoyed as a curiosity for fans, and it's certainly not bad, but it's nothing worth going out of your way for. I think a 6.3 out of 10. So now we're going to fast forward all the way into the 80s with music for supermarkets. Now this, despite not sounding too far off from Jarre's past work, has achieved an infamous status, because only one legal copy of the album exists. As the album was supposed to be the soundtrack at an art exhibition, Jarre designed the album to also be a one-off piece of art. He printed one copy, had it played on AM radio once, auctioned it off for charity for over $10,000, and it was never heard in high quality again. After that, the album's owner got into a car crash and survived, waking up to hear Jarre's Souvenir of China single playing on the radio. And as far as I know, no one actually knows who currently owns the album now, though most of this information is taken from Wikipedia and one particular Jean-Michel Jarre related forum, so I don't know how much of this story is true, but needless to say the album has attained a legendary status from this story. But not all is lost. Many people were able to hear the album on AM radio, as mentioned before, and record bootlegs of it. In fact, Jarre apparently encouraged people to do so, leading the album to end up reaching the ears of people like myself years after the fact. The downside of this is that anyone who's ever heard AM radio knows that the audio ended up in very poor quality. But in this case, I guess we'll take what we can get. Of course, just because an intriguing story lies behind an album isn't necessarily a testament to its quality. And honestly, while I think Music for Supermarkets is a good album, I wouldn't put it up among Jarre's absolute best. A couple of tracks were pretty obviously reworked into later albums. For instance, parts 4 and 6 were eventually further fleshed out on his next album, Zuluk, Blah Blah Cafe and Diva, respectively, and part 2 ended up on Rendezvous in a particular section of Fifth Rendezvous. I can't help but connect those versions to their final incarnations on their respective albums, especially when it comes to the tracks that eventually landed on Zuluk, because I listen the crap out of Zuluk. And it does definitely take a bit away from the listening experience of this album. I'd rather hear those tracks in high quality in their final versions. Hearing the album in its original incarnation is definitely interesting, though. As you'd probably expect, the album is themed around supermarkets, and there are many sections of the album that have supermarket ambient sounds, usually as transitions between songs. As for the actual music, the album is not particularly subtle. It's quite over-the-top and bombastic, though that could be a result of having to be streamed low quality on AM radio. The overture sets the tone for the album and is a bombastic dance piece, actually quite catchy. I'd have liked to hear the original of this one. Part 1, the one that got released on the new Planet Jarre compilation, it has some high-pitched whistling, as well as some creepy sounding dark synth washes. Part 3 mostly has the supermarket ambience with a little lighthearted melody along the lines of The Last Roomba from Magnetic Fields, fading as the song progresses. Part 5 is an ambient track with a lot of synth strings and some water sound effects occasionally, and finally Part 7, quite similar to Part 3 in that it starts out with the supermarket ambience and then fades in with a melody on some kind of synth flute, adding some synth saxophone or whatever and a foreboding bass line before finally ending with more supermarket ambience. It's a bit of an ambiguous and unsatisfying ending in my opinion, but I guess it's still pretty cool. Overall, the album by itself is pretty good, but I just recommend skipping it, honestly. The low quality and reused tracks take away from the album experience quite a bit, and the tracks that don't appear on later albums aren't usually the best ones. The only exception is the overture, which I do actually think was a very nice track on its own, and I suppose to a lesser extent Part 5, but most of the best stuff here can be found on later albums and in actual high quality. The album, it really isn't much more than a curiosity at this point. Check out if you've become a diehard Jarre fan, but otherwise I'd say it's not worth the trouble. Head over to Zuluk and Rendezvous instead. If I were to hear it in high quality, it might be like a 7.3 out of 10, but having to endure it in AM radio quality drags it down to like a 5.7. And now we fast forward to 2001, where we talk about interior music. Oh boy. This is marked as a proper studio album, and honestly I probably could have given this a proper video, but nah, there's not enough to say. I'm just going to be blunt and say I think this album is Jarre's worst album overall. This was basically made as a promotion for the electronics store Bang & Olufsen. It's two 25-minute ambient pieces called Bonjour, Hello, and Whispers of Life. Bonjour, Hello had the bright idea to fill all the empty space with voices periodically coming in and saying random phrases and sentences in different languages. Now in theory this could end up being something like Zulik meets Waiting for Cousteau, but an execution is just one of the most awkward things I've ever heard. There is a man voice and a woman voice speaking constantly, but they do not sound like they're actually having a conversation. It's just completely random, and quite frankly the final effect is uncomfortable and distracting more than anything. Voices say stuff like, "You look gorgeous. Oh, you look gorgeous. Have you loved somebody? Clean up the mess. How are you doing today? Bang & Olufsen." Yeah, he threw some marketing for the store in there. The other piece, Whispers of Life, is just the instrumental version of Bonjour, Hello, and I'll admit it's much better when you don't have the voices in there, but I still wouldn't call it that great. It again just kind of jumps from idea to idea randomly. Some engaging atmosphere may come in for a few seconds, but doesn't last long enough to actually stick with you. It feels a little disjointed and odd, and I don't care for the titular whispering that comes in about 19 minutes into the running time. It's a bit too all over the place for it to work that well as background music, and it's not like the ideas presented were all that out of the box in the first place. They just don't stick around long enough to leave an impact. I guess at the end of the day, interior music is at least interesting. There's no album I've ever heard remotely like it, and I guess it might be worth checking out just for how strange it is. But for me personally, this is really only worth a listen for curiosity's sake, and has no replay value to me outside of that. I mean, Whispers of Life, it's good, but it's far from the best Jarre can do. It is not even remotely as fun as Waiting for Cousteau, which had much less going on, but was so much more compelling and immersive. And Hello Bonjour, I have no idea what Jarre was thinking with that. Interior music, I guess at the end of the day, it's interesting, but to me it's a below-average failed experiment, and given how rare it is, it's not worth the trouble of seeking out. I'm feeling a 5.7 out of 10. And then we're fast-forwarding all the way to last year, where he released Radiophonie number 9. This is also marked as a main studio album from Jarre, but, like, can we not even pretend that's the case at all? Interior music, you could make the case for being a proper album with artistic direction and stuff, despite how not well executed it was, and being a promotion for a store. This is a compilation of radio jingles and stingers. Like, one could look at the track listing and see that there's 99 tracks, all titled Hexagon, as if part of the same piece, but they're not part of the same piece. They're just little radio jingles. And aside from a small handful, most of them are only like 10 seconds long, if even that. There are a good handful of tracks where it at least tries to go for maybe 2 minutes, maybe one that is 3 minutes. And the music itself is good. It sounds like he made like some alternate versions of that track he did with Jeff Mills on Electronica 2, The Architect. And then he cut all these versions up into a million pieces and presented them in weird different ways. I'll admit, it makes for a really unusual and not the most engaging listening experience that develops a strong groove every now and then, but usually just starts and stops way too quickly thanks to the shortness of the pieces. But the music itself is actually pretty enjoyable, all things considered. I won't give this a rating, but I'll say it's worth a shot, I guess. Now we're rewinding all the way back to, I think, 1982, I believe, with the concerts in China. So, Jarre has released a ton of live albums, and most of them obviously do not offer much material for me to discuss. I mean, Jarre's concerts are always stellar, and I can speak from experience having seen one myself a few years back, though I never bothered with his actual live albums, because most of them don't have enough material for proper discussion. But this isn't one of those, and it's not just because this album marks the first time a Western artist performed live in China after they had their cultural revolution. I mean, that is definitely a pretty cool fact, and one that Jarre definitely wears on his sleeve. But I get the feeling more people ask me about this live album more because of the original pieces exclusive just to it. I think the most notable one has to be the single that closes the album out, Souvenir of China. This is the one track from this album that I actually have some nostalgia for thanks to his later Aero compilation, which I'll get to in a bit. This was a really big hit for Jarre from what I hear, and I'll admit it is certainly a classic track for him. The string pads, slow plodding beat, and camera shutter sound effects, they're all really iconic. While I personally wouldn't rank it among my personal favorites from him ever, it is a really important single from him that you definitely gotta hear at some point. As for the other stuff on here, the main highlight is probably Fishing Junks at Sunset, which is a really neat arrangement of an old traditional Chinese tune, him combining his electronic sound with all the traditional Chinese instrumentation and composition gives off some strong Andreas Vollenweider vibes. It is very nice. Probably my favorite track on this album. There's also Orient Express, which sounds like a leftover from Magnetic Fields, the energetic and dramatic Arpeggiator and Night in Shanghai, which were both a ton of fun. Not every track was that incredible. The Laser Harp piece was a letdown for me given how I've seen that Laser Harp live and associate one particular synth setting with it, as seen on, I think, Third Rendezvous and The Time Machine. And that setting didn't show up here. It's just kind of a plain soundscape piece of his that, I've heard plenty of stuff like before. And I was also kind of disappointed to hear that the overture was just Magnetic Fields Part 1 slowed down, though the synth guitar solo near the back half was cool. The rest of this stuff is just the originals from his first 3 main albums, which I've heard plenty of times before. Actually, there's nothing from Oxygen, surprisingly. It's just Equinoxing Magnetic Fields, and the latter album in its entirety appears here. Whatever, given how it's just a live album, I won't give it a rating, but the Concerts in China is certainly a landmark release in the Jarre catalog, and I will say it's worth checking out. Moving on from there, next live album that I have things to say about is Printemps de Bourges, 2002. This concert, from what I can tell, is all original material specific to this album, so I will actually give it a rating and stuff. There's only 4 tracks, but all in all, it's a pretty solid jam that sounds like what you would expect Jarre to sound like in 2002. It's almost like a transition from Metamorphoses to Sessions 2000, like, it's not as big an event as the former, but still focuses on that same palette of digital synths and software. And it's not as low-key and jazzy as Sessions 2000, but it is maybe a bit on the chill side, and it is similarly unusual sounding and experimental for him. Just experimental in a different way. The highlight is probably unsurprisingly the 23-minute opener Alive in Bourges? Mostly a low-key, breakbeat-infused trance tune with a nice long side track for some choirs like the ones that would later show up on the title track from Electronica 1 The Time Machine. And there's a piece of slow-moving metallic ambience fittingly called Metallic Souvenir, a strange and frantic experimental piece called Body Language, apparently left over from Metamorphoses, and finally Paris Bourges, a more experimental companion to the opener with more low-key trance beats and theremin accompaniment. I can't honestly say I think this concert is essential listening by any stretch, but it's got some cool stuff on it. I guess it's a solid 7 out of 10 for me. And the last live album I gotta mention technically isn't even Jarre's own, but rather a tribute of sorts. Talking about the Symphonic Jean-Michel Jarre, performed by the City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra and Crouch End Festival Chorus, conducted by Nick Rain. And yes, I did have to mention all of those names because that's where they're sorted under on iTunes, not under Jarre himself. But yes, there exists an album of orchestral covers of Jarre's music, which, let's be real, that makes too much sense. I mean, Jarre's music already is often kind of just classical music played on synthesizers. The transition to full live orchestra is a pretty obvious idea. And it is just as awesome as it sounds. A whole bunch of tracks from throughout his career, including not just really obvious picks like Oxygen 4 and Equinox 4, but also rarer tracks specific to certain compilations like El Dorado from his Images comp and Acropolis, which was a track he did as a tribute to Pope John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, and never got a proper studio release. And if you're not convinced that this isn't worth checking out, I'll just play you a little bit of the Equinox 4 cover. So yeah, this is amazing. I would highly recommend picking it up at some point. Moving on, I'm turning this on. So next we're going into compilations that I have things to say about, starting out with Aero. Now, some people were asking me, why didn't I make this one a proper video? Are you just going to skip it? Isn't it like Jarre's equivalent to Kraftwerk's The Mix? Yes and no. I mean, I picked it up a long time ago, and it does have some nostalgia factor for me. It provides newer mixes of lots of old Jarre tracks that are different enough to justify their existence. And apparently there's also like a 5.1 surround mix or something I haven't heard. But these versions also aren't different enough that Aero needed an entire video to itself like the mix did. There are a couple of original tracks on this album. There's the title track, which is really just a less interesting instrumental of Je me souviens from Metamorphoses. There's the energetic and fun Aerology, and there's the strange soundscapes and jittery sequences of Aerozone. I will say that as far as greatest hits albums go, this actually does provide its own experience. You couldn't just get out of putting the originals in the playlist and going from there. It's worth a shot for sure. It's a really good introduction for people who've never heard any Jarre before, and I would say it's worth checking out. But I also still consider it a greatest hits comp first and foremost. I don't consider it a mainline album, and as such it will not be getting a rating. But it is good. And to finish off this video, I'll of course be talking about his latest release that just dropped today, Planet Jarre. Now, really easy Infinity War joke and the album cover aside, this is another greatest hits comp that I thought was going to be like Aero and rework his old classics into his new style. But no, not really. Most of them are just remastered, with a few exceptions. There are a couple of tracks that do actually have new reworked versions. I guess he has from live sets or something. Like Zoolocology, Magnetic Fields Part 2, Chronology 4, Oxygen 8. And there are a few others that sound like they were reworked, but I couldn't totally tell. I think maybe Millions of Stars was as well. Those all sound really cool, but like I kind of skimmed through the rest of the project and heard some of the remasters, and they are really inconsistent. Some sound good, like you can better hear the text-to-speech singing on Bells from Metamorphoses, but some emphatically do not sound good. See Equinox 4. Wow, yikes. That one sounded like he ran it through a tin can. I guess I do think the idea of the comp is cool, with him organizing his past work into the 4 sections: soundscapes, themes, sequences, and explorations and early works. And there are a couple of tracks specific to this comp here. There's Coachella Opening, which I wish he'd given a proper title. Sounds pretty typical by his standards, honestly, aside from some weird dubstep influence sounds in parts, but otherwise, it's a pretty nice track from him. Also, Herbalizer is this darker breakbeat hip-hop tinged thing. He played this track in the concert I attended. I think it went down better live, but it's a pretty nice track here, too. The Explorations and Early Work section was probably the most interesting to me, given how it had a couple of tracks from his really early days that I had yet to hear. There was an excerpt of Music for Supermarkets with proper mastering and high-quality audio that I think is nice to finally hear, even if it is just, I think it's part 1. It was not one of the big highlight sections from that album. I would have preferred the overture, but I'm being picky. We have better sounding versions of La Cage and Erosmachine, which are cool. There's a weird little tune called Hypnos, which sounds like it came out of the Deserted Palace days. And there's also Happiness is a Sad Song, which I'm told was the first track Jarre ever composed, even before La Cage and Erosmachine. And it's just pure experimental Pink Floyd Ummagumma weirdness, with a lot of human voices just making weird noises. It's neat, I guess. Oh, and there's a track called AOR Blue, which is just metallic souvenir from the Printemps de Bourges live album I mentioned above. Apologize for saying Bourges wrong. As a whole, honestly, I can't really mark Planet Jarre as anything essential. It's just a greatest hits comp. I think if you want a greatest hits comp to introduce you to all things Jarre, Aero will do you much better than this. I mean, that's only 1 album instead of 4, and every track has a new remaster. This is really all over the place, even as somebody who already knows 95% of all the material on this thing already. It's a bit unwieldy, honestly, and while the exclusive material is great, it's not enough to recommend the whole thing. I think you can check out the exclusive stuff, but I don't think there's anything you absolutely need on Planet Jarre. So, No rating here either. And to end the video on a more optimistic note, today Jarre also announced that he was going to be releasing another new album this November called Equinox Infinity. So hopefully with it being all new original material, it'll fare better. I doubt it'll be on Oxygen 3's level, but it'll probably be fun. We'll see. I'm gonna finish the video there. Of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. If you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.